Nope. Nope.
Well, and there's been some interesting memes floating around about Bud Light cans and what they should have had on them. And one of them was Pat Tillman. I saw that would have been a great can. Put a real hero like Pat Tillman on Bud Light cans, and I think everyone could get behind that.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I mean, the boycott that they are seeing. I mean, sales from Budweiser, they have lost between $4 and $6 billion in market value.
It'll be interesting to see how this sustains, like in a month, and then 6 months, and then 2 years, because Budweiser's clearly trying to run interference, and even the Trumps have come out and said, "Oh, you should still drink Budweiser," which is a little bit odd. But I do think it's going to be interesting to see whether this boycott is sustained. And at this point, there seems to be a lot of energy behind it. I mean, Nashville's own Kid Rock was pretty, about as explicit as you could get on that. But whether or not that maintains over the next 6 months and year will be very interesting to follow.
Yeah, I think he made several statements in that little media clip he put out.
Yes.
Now, so do you have any good news for us? Are you seeing the trend change anywhere? I know you herald from Southern California. Wasn't there some Stanford news?
Oh, yeah, Stanford, believe it or not, Stanford, the center, absolute epicenter of woke culture in the whole country. A couple days ago, a party slate of people supporting partying and sports won their student council elections, which, the woke students went insane over this. But it's a wild story. And even kids, even 19-year-olds who are supposedly the most woke among us, especially at Stanford, said, "We've had enough of this. We want people who like sports and partying." And watching this play out will be just hysterical. But it seems like if it can happen there, it can really happen anywhere.
Yes. It is encouraging to see it happen on college campuses where they are constantly trying to indoctrinate our children into this way of thinking.
I mean, remember, Stanford was that place a few weeks ago where they invited in a circuit court judge from Texas.
Yes.
And the law students shouted him down, which was just unbelievably rude and disrespectful. And then the undergrads there turn around a month later and say, we're going to elect a pro-sports and pro-partying slate to run the student council. I mean, that is quite a turn in a short amount of time and should give us all perhaps a little bit of hope.
Yeah, I think those student council kids are good. They probably sent them running to their safe space and finding hug ponies and support ponies, which is always fun.
Right.
And I pointed out from Newt's daily letter that he puts out that these are, you would think from the media that everyone thinks this way, and that we as conservatives or libertarians or moderates just have to adopt this language, that we have to change our belief system to fit just a fringe of the Democratic Party, but has become the people who are running the show in the Democratic Party. I mean, this is not your grandparents' or your parents' Democratic Party. This is supposed to be, they hold themselves out to be the party of women and children. Remember all Nancy Pelosi? I do it for the children. It's all for the children. And I don't see them standing up for any of our children on any of these issues.
No, in fact, as you know, I worked for Newt Gingrich for 6 years, and he was a fantastic boss. And not a day goes by where I don't do or say something where I think to myself, I learned that from Newt. But he drew on the whiteboard in our office one day, and this was just it's more of a visual than me talking about it, but it's still very easy to picture. He drew a little sailboat on a lake or on an ocean, and he said the current at the top is pushing it one way, but the 95% of the water underneath may be flowing the other way. And he said that's the American public and the media. The overwhelming majority on one side going one direction, you have the media at the very, very top, and they're just they're completely in the opposite direction. But I do think that's starting to change as well. There's, the legacy media sites keep losing market share. Locally, the Washington Post keeps declining. The New York Times keeps needing to get rescued. I don't know if anyone saw. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend the two-part interview of Elon Musk by Tucker Carlson the last 2 days, where he talks about his efforts in Silicon Valley and in the tech world to turn things around. It's a very illuminating interview. I highly recommend it. He talks about everything from artificial intelligence to the media to massive media bias, but very, very good. And you can find it on YouTube for free and without commercials. So I recommend anyone take a look at it.
Yeah, he was my man of the year last year for taking over Twitter. And to be honest, I wouldn't even care if he had just closed it. I would have been fine with that as well. But I think he has an ability. Well, I mean, he's a pretty bright guy. First off, the fact that NASA asks him for help should kind of tell you something. But he really just got a sense of what was going on there with Twitter, and he's a big free speech guy. And, anything that makes the left run for cover and cry, I enjoy.
Well, most interesting thing, too, what he did in making Twitter more politically neutral, is he fired over 80% of the staff, and it works better. I mean, think about that. Think of any business where you could fire 80% of the staff and it actually works better. It makes you wonder, if someone came into Washington, D.C. with some real plans, they could probably get rid of 80% of the bureaucrats here, and the federal government would work better.
Oh, amen.
But I think you've seen a lot of the tech companies now start to lay off a lot of their useless employees, and I think they've really gotten fattened up with useless people who literally do nothing. All these Instagram videos of people coming in and having breakfast at 10 o'clock and then having a long lunch and then a coffee and then an early happy hour. And they brag about this. And I was like, what exactly do you do? It's like that line from Office Space. What would you say you do here? Well, I think Elon walked in and he looked around and he said, what would you say you do here? And a handful of the former employees typed up on Twitter, and he responded to them and said, explain what your job is, and they would make some weak effort, and then Elon would just laugh and say, yeah, that's why you're gone. And that happened several times. And a lot of the tech world and a lot of the rest of the world is looking around going, God, we really do have a lot of useless employees.
Yes.
But I think most people, no matter what your job, you can probably look around and say, at least a third of these people, if they stop showing up, our company would work better. I know I've had that experience over the years, and probably most people have. But I think you'll find 80% of the people on the product works better is pretty wild and very illuminating.
Yes, their biggest concern was, where's my stapler? Who took my stapler? Yeah.
Right.
That kind of says it all.
Yeah, it does.
So as it relates to this, whole issue with wokeness, I know that most people as conservatives, now I will exempt myself from that because I'm behind a microphone. So clearly I don't mind putting myself out there. I've already been canceled. It's very liberating, folks. But what I want to say to, because we've always been that silent majority. And these are good people who just want to do their jobs. They want to run their business. They want to be good mothers and fathers and take care of their families. And they don't want to get involved in all of this stuff. And I have come to a point where at this point, we don't have a choice of standing up and making our values known and saying, nope, we're not going there. We're not going to do this because, as Dan Mandis pointed out yesterday on the show, and I thought it was a very telling point, you never see the left give an inch on anything. And if you try and meet them halfway, you're just going to go halfway down the wrong road. But the bigger point is that you get nothing for it because this woke doctrine is all-encompassing, and you have to accept every tenet and piece of it, no matter how extreme it is, or they will cancel you.
Right, and the left protects its own much better than the right does. The left, you'll never see Nancy Pelosi condemn her far left, whereas the media routinely will ask Kevin McCarthy or other people to condemn something said by someone on the fringe right. So I think the right could learn a little bit more from how the left protects their own all the time. That's one of the dynamics I've noticed over the years. They left will just not take the question or just change the subject real quick, but they never condemn their own, whereas the right is kind of, that's unfortunately kind of quick to on occasion. But again, I do think the tide is starting to turn, and I would hope it's a large red tidal wave next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need some spine. I think we need some backbone, and I think that mothers and fathers across this country have to start speaking up, and they have to start speaking up now. We've seen this in Nashville, in our own backyard, when we had the media come in and try and push their narrative on a tragedy here. And we got to start saying no. Jim, we have to do a quick commercial break. If you will stay with us, we will be right back on Super Talk 99.7 WTN.
Alabama law enforcement just updated the media on the mass shooting, and we've got the details for you coming up at 10:30 on Super Talk 99.7 WTN.
And we're back on Super Talk. Joining us, our guest, Jim Frogue. Jim, talking about all this woke stuff, it kind of puts me in a bad place. Any other good news you got for us? Anything edifying? Any way that this is trending in our direction that I don't see?
Well, aside from the things we mentioned and at Stanford and Miami-Dade County, the counter currents are starting to rise up. I think that's good. But for your amusement, you can sort of imagine some of these woke people being left to fend for themselves. I mean, what if we put all the woke people in, Oregon or Washington State or whatever and said, all right, handshake, amicable, have fun, and see what happens to them in a year or 2 or 3. And they can't farm, they can't do anything. And they disrespect the people who actually provide our food and provide, like plumbing, for example, or things that actually make infrastructure work. It'd be interesting to see how they would survive. And, they may like it because they get away from those nasty conservatives. So maybe it'd be a win-win.
Yeah, I've just never seen it quite like this. If you'd told us 5 years ago that we'd be sitting on air together, having to defend women's sports, it just you don't have to go back very far, and to my point of it never ends for them. It is just they exist to create these perceived inequities, and then they just keep adding to the narrative. It's a never-ending cycle. So my thing is, let's just get off that train. Let's.
Well, and I think when Newt comes on here in a few minutes, and I'm so glad you got him as a guest. It'll be great. I'm glad I'm going first. Following Newt would be impossible. I've had to do it before. It's not fun. The audience is more interested in him, and that's for good reason.
Yes.
But in 1968, in the late 60s and early 70s, America went crazy left as well. Now, Nixon won gigantic landslides, obviously, but the culture and the media was very left-wing, and that fever broke. And eventually we got around to the late 70s, and that was still kind of a mess, but then Reagan came in and really restored America's pride and place in the world. But it might be worth asking Newt that. How did we break the fever in the late 60s and early 70s?
That is a tremendous question. I am absolutely going to bring that up with them.
Yeah, because, he lived through it. He was young at that point. He wasn't in Congress yet, but he was certainly in his college years, so he would remember. And I'm sure he would have a great answer as to how the culture, took a look at the far left and said, no, not this. And, hopefully we can move in the other direction soon in the next few years.
Yes. And, one of the issues where the woke policy it shows that it just completely doesn't work is as it relates to crime. And just to use a personal example, when I was in the administration, you and I happened to live in the same building in Navy Yard, which we could go home at 2 a.m. and feel safe. How has that changed just in the last 2 years with the woke DAs that are now just letting people commit crimes and then releasing them to go right back out and do it again?
Yeah, the D.C. City Council at the end of last year passed a resolution scaling back penalties for violent crimes. And that was right when the violent crimes were starting to uptick. So, the sane response would say, okay, more carjackings, more assaults, we need to crack down on that. They literally got together and passed something to say, oh, no, we're going to scale back penalties. So, predictably, you've seen a lot more crime and carjackings. There's, many per week. There are usually several per day. The Washington Post and the big media outlets don't report on it, but some of the smaller Twitter accounts that I follow are reporting on it by the hour, not even by the day, by the hour. And especially as the weather gets nicer, the crime's going to get worse. So it's hard to, Chicago's the same way with this new mayor who's even worse than the last one. What's going on in New York and some other places, but it's almost like it's hard to think they're anything other than just pro-crime. And, most people are just absolutely sick of that.
I think so. But the very apartment that we lived in, haven't there been multiple murders there since we left? Aren't they giving away like free several months rent? I'm not going to say the name of the place because I like the folks.
Yeah, well, I think that's a big tell. They've gone from, most people when they move into a new place, they rent an apartment, they might get a month free or they might get some concessions. It's in Navy Yard now, it's gone up to 2 months and some of them even more than that because it's hard to get people to pay attention. And again, it's very telling that the Washington Post doesn't cover this or covers it very, very lightly. But people, there's a Twitter called Navy Yard Crime, I believe. There's a guy named Alan Henney. And there's a handful of others, DC Real Crime. I think I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but there's a handful of smaller accounts that follow the police scanners. And this is what real people are listening to. It's another example. Going back to our discussion at the beginning, the media is saying one thing, going one direction, and everyone else underneath is looking completely the other direction. And, obviously this is D.C., but there's a lot of places that are similar in that the people are like, we're just sick of this crime, yet the people and the media just don't want to report on it.
Yes, it's unbelievable. It will take quite a bit to get back to the shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan spoke of. Jim, we've come to the end of our allotted time. Can't thank you enough for being in the nation's capital, so I don't have to be. So, say
hi to Newt for me, and you'll have a great interview with him.
Will
Ask
do.
him how he turned D.C. around, by the way, too. In 1995 and 96, when he was Speaker, they stripped Mayor Marion Barry of all of his power. And D.C., that's right when D.C. turned around from being a violent cesspool to actually being quite livable for about 25, 30 years.
Yes.
And now it's going the other direction. So I'd be really interested in his perspective on that. Not to tell you how to do your job. You know how to do your job. But these are some questions I would take. But given his historical perspective, he really can put things in a context that you and I and most people can't.
Yes, absolutely. We will do it. Thank you, Jim, so much. We will be right back with news on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.
I'm Ken Weaver with your top stories. Another beautiful day on the way. Changes are coming. Got the full forecast in 2 minutes. Alabama's Sweet 16 birthday party shooting update. Law enforcement say 2 teenagers have been arrested in connection with that party shooting. It killed 4 people, injured 32. Right now in Tennessee, a school safety strengthening bill up for another key vote in the House, and if it passes, it goes to the governor's desk. Here in Nashville, the resolution requiring police take over Metro school safety plans rejected last night in the Metro Council comes after school board members expressed concern it could expose weaknesses in school security to the public. District 26 Metro Council member Courtney Johnston tells WTN's Nashville's Morning News she thinks it's more about the Metro School Board wanting to avoid accountability.
These are just in general recommendations that the MNPD would say about any building, more than likely.
That is the latest news. Weather is next. I'm Ken Weaver, WTN News.
Hi, I'm Paul Winkler. Have you ever thought about why we invest in the stock market? Well, you often hear because we want to protect ourselves from inflation. Well, what is inflation? It's prices going up. Who's raising prices? Companies. What do you own when you own stocks? You own the companies raising prices, so it helps protect us from that. The other thing is this. Think about the most successful people you know. They're typically business owners. And you get to be a business owner when you invest in the stock market. Now, if we think about the stock market, a lot of people worry about, well, what if the stock market drops and it never comes back? Well, this is another thing that I like to explain to people. If the stock market goes down and it never comes back, what does that mean? That means that earnings went down and they never came back up again. So earnings went down. If earnings go down, what else goes down? Taxes go down. If taxes go away, what else goes away? The government goes away. If the government goes away, the FDIC goes away. So think about it. Everything is built on the stock market. That's why I don't ever worry about the stock market going down. Everybody has the same goal in mind when stocks go down. Get it to come back up because we got to get earnings to come back up. Now, you have 2 things at your control to get earnings to come back up. One is sales. We can change what we're selling or sell more of whatever we have if we can. And if we can't do that, we can reduce our expenses. And that's exactly what companies do. You'll notice that they lay off people when things get bad, and hence that is why the stock market has recovered from every downturn throughout all of history. Now, if you want to learn more about our approach to investing and financial planning, go to paulwinkler.com and set up a free 15-minute phone call or call 615-851-1950.
And we're back on Super Talk. This is Matt Bassett on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon here in Nashville. And just want to remind our listeners that we have coming up in the next hour a man who needs no introduction, perhaps the most consequential thought leader of conservatives in the Republican Party for the last 25 years, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. And he will be followed by the anti-Dr. Fauci, Dr. Robert Redfield, my former colleague, the head of the CDC, and the person who has been consistently right on COVID. And I'm thrilled to have with us Jonathan Williams. He puts together this amazing piece of work every year on rich states and poor states and the business climate there, where people are moving, where they are not moving. I already know where Tennessee ranks, but we'll keep you guessing for just a little bit. We were not number one, so I've got some lobbying to do with Jonathan. Then again, I'm not sure I want that many more people moving here. After Mac and I had to get through traffic to get here this morning, I think we're pretty good. Mac, you?
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a good call.
Every day I come in, it takes just a little bit longer. But I do want to welcome into the program Jonathan Williams. Jonathan, how are you?
Well, good morning. Doing well, and greetings here from the land of make-believe in Washington, D.C.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for being a part of the program. I have teased it a little bit, but give us the overview of what you saw in the rich state, poor states, and the rankings, and we won't make people wait any longer. How did Tennessee do?
Well, in short, Tennessee ranks well. I mean, but maybe not as well as some of your listeners may think. Is it a great growth state? Is a state that's a no-income tax state? A state we're very proud of with a lot of the decisions that your policymakers have made over the years. But Tennessee comes in at 11th this year for economic outlook.
11? We didn't make the top 10, Jonathan.
Well, it's a lot of competition at the top, my friend. You know,
yes.
You've got some really great things going on across the country, and states are utilizing, I think, this magic moment that we have with historic budget surpluses, some of which are good, some of which are federal money with the so-called free lunch coming from D.C. You know how big of a problem that is. But nonetheless, I mean, states have been dramatically cutting taxes across the board, and the advantages that Tennessee has had over the years, can start to erode over time when states are just so aggressive at trying to do the right thing and get that money back into the hands of hardworking taxpayers and businesses.
Okay. Let's talk about our competition. So let's begin with the end in mind. Who is number one?
So Utah is number one, and they've been number one, believe it or not, for all 16 editions of Rich States, Poor States. So day one, when Art Laffer, of course, one of the most famous Nashville residents, former California resident.
Yes.
He and Steve Moore, who I know you had on the show recently, when they came to us with this idea of, how do we put together this report and give a real nonpartisan barometer for state policymakers and concerned citizens of how does our state stack up versus the other 49 in this competitive environment and these laboratories of democracy, as we've talked about. And, Utah's been one since the start. They've been a state that has gotten it right because I think they've done so many good things, from reform their pension system to really stop property tax increases from happening over the years, an issue that has vexed states all across the country, looking at ways of trying to figure out if all this federal money coming to the states, when does this stop and when does the gravy train end, and what do you do so you're not left holding the bag when it does, and how do you avoid all these costly federal regulations that come with this money. So Utah's just been a really, I think, forward-looking state. And by the way, don't take my word for it. Utah is the fastest growing state in America by population over the last 10 years. They grew nearly 20% as a state. So while the traffic is certainly, I know, gnarly in Nashville and places around Tennessee after the great growth that you've seen, Utah even outpaced Tennessee when it comes to population growth. And I think that's because when you get it right on policy at the state level, success follows, and people vote with their feet, and we're seeing it every single year. And they're leaving high tax states and going to states that value taxpayers, to keep taxes low, and of course states like Tennessee that avoid an income tax altogether. One of the most important things in our research that you can do at the state level.
Well, okay. you have an unbelievable amount of methodology that goes into this, but I have a theory on why a lot of people move to Utah, and that is that Californians are too lazy to drive here. It's right next door. Okay, it takes some effort to pick up and move across the country, although I have to say to that point, almost everyone I have met to a person in the last 6 months has moved here from California.
Well, let's hope they're not bringing their bad ideas with them, right? And I think that's one of the big questions that you get.
No, I'll tell you, I actually I would like for us to issue a formal test from the governor's office. It would be like a simple questionnaire. And in talking with them, to the person, I'll say, congratulations on your escape. And if they don't immediately laugh, we know there's a problem.
Hey, that's right. They're tax refugees in a lot of cases, right? And they're escaping the highest income tax in America. And you probably know what that is, Matt. It's, over 13% at the state level for higher income earners in California, and it going to zero. I mean, that's a great trade up right there.
Yes. And Gavin Newsom uses his stewardship of the state as a reason that he should be a leading Democrat contender. I just don't understand that. I run my state into the ground. I deserve to be president.
Well, on that point, it's a very interesting one. He's been making this red state tour and has been advertising, the so-called successes of California. And until recently, he had a massive budget surplus of $100 billion. He was saying, hey, look, at this is the success of our progressive policies. But, a funny thing happened in that was in January, that $100 billion went away and it became guess what, $25 billion budget shortfall. And the reason that even Gavin Newsom admitted after a while, the Wall Street Journal reported on this, was it was because California depends so much on the wealthy to get all of their budget spending, right? I mean, to capital gains realizations, dividends, taxing Silicon Valley companies and high income earners. And guess what's the most volatile source of revenue for the states? It's capital-based taxes like that. And it doesn't, don't take conservative free market economist Jonathan Williams' word for it. Take even Gavin Newsom, who admitted that, to say this is one of the shortcomings of California, is this progressive income tax regime.
Well, I think he got a little sensitive about all of his folks moving to Florida. I think that's his real beef with DeSantis, and you can't get more of a juxtaposition of policy than between Florida and California right now.
That's right. I mean, the free state of Florida and the not free state of California. And, the funny thing is these fake news economists like Paul Krugman at the New York Times likes to say the only reason people are moving to Florida and Texas and Tennessee is because of better weather and they're leaving the north. Well, guess who has probably the best weather on earth?
Year-round.
And it does not explain anything outside of bad policy happening. And how do they mess that up in California?
Well, California had passed a law that basically prohibited their state employees to traveling to states that, in their opinion, did not have friendly LGBTQ policies there. And Tennessee was on that, and they've had such a bad reaction to that. Even the left is calling it divisive and saying we need to move away from these policies. I think the reason they didn't want them traveling to any other state is because they were afraid they were just going to leave when they saw what was there.
Yeah, don't expose them too much to freedom or they may want to stay. And, the other thing that's clearly unconstitutional, but they've tried, as you probably saw this in the news with California and their public retirees of their pension system, is they have tried to say, regardless if you leave the state of California or not, we're still going to apply California income taxes to your pension income when you move. And so they realize they've got a problem, and they're trying some very interesting and unconstitutional ways of keeping that money in California.
Okay, can I ask you about some other states?
Sure.
To this point, let's see how some of the first of all, where is California ranked?
California is always bottom 10. They're 45th this year, but there's a lot of competition at the bottom. New York's 50th, for instance. Bernie Sanders' Vermont is 49. So right there, it's a tall order to dethrone those states.
How about Illinois?
Illinois is always bottom 10 as well. And so Illinois comes in at 46 in the bottom 5 this year. Another really interesting one at the bottom is Minnesota, a state that had been a state that has been growing over the years and now has had a huge reversal of that due to big government policies that are being enacted. And especially this session, they've just gone really in a very left-wing direction, and they're 48 this year, their worst ranking ever. So they're giving Illinois some competition in the Midwest for bad policies. Generally, as a Midwesterner from Michigan originally, I always considered Illinois as our best economic development partner in the Midwest, growing jobs and individuals to all the states in the region.
Well, I only have 2 or 3 good friends in Chicago. One is an actor that I am not allowed to mention on air lest he be canceled. And the other one is Stephen Moore, who was on the program last week, and he was lamenting the fact that they elected to City Hall a person that was even more insane than Mayor Lightfoot. And, he was lamenting this on air, and I said, well, Art lives here. Why don't you just come down here? That's the type of person we would love to have living with us here in Middle Tennessee.
Well, and to that point, I mean, you do talk to a lot of the folks that are leaving New York or leaving California or leaving Illinois, and they're the business owner types, right, that just say, we built our business here, maybe our parents did or our grandparents did, their small business has been around for generations in some cases, but we just can't sit around and take it anymore. When you combine the big government tax policies with the regulation, and then now this just ineptitude of happening in the big cities in so many of these states where they are not enforcing and prosecuting violent crime. I mean, that is the last straw where we saw, in Seattle and Portland, Oregon, obviously, 2 states that had done fairly well in recent years when it comes to in-migration and business growth. They are now hemorrhaging residents because of this toxic combination of bad crime policies as well as big government taxes and regulation.
Yes, and so we've covered that Tennessee is 11, which is pretty good. But since you have spent so much time on this and putting out the study, is there anything that we in Tennessee can do to improve from your perspective?
There is. Everywhere, right? I mean, every state can improve. Even, Utah continues to improve after they ranked number 1 for 16 years in a row. Their Senate president gathered us together out in Salt Lake to say, how do we continue to improve and stay at number 1? Because they know Arizona has moved up tremendously. They know North Carolina has been a huge success story and a turnaround story. And so, every state has something to improve upon. And in Tennessee's case, certainly the sales tax burden is too high. You look at things like the recently legislated tax changes as well, as other states have aggressively moved the ball forward in cutting tax rates on net and getting that hard-earned money back from the surpluses into the hands of hardworking entrepreneurs. That hasn't been happening in recent years in Tennessee as it has across much of the country. We've had nearly 25 states in the last 2 legislative sessions alone, Matt, that have substantially cut taxes. And, Tennessee has not been one of those. And so I think that's a real issue that does stand out in addition to the sales tax burden. And of course, you've got other issues on business regulations and others. Debt services, the share of tax revenue is too high. And so there's lots of ways to improve, but you've got great people in Nashville in the legislature. You've got a great governor that's trying to move in the right direction.
Yes.
It's just a question of, how aggressively can you move in this, period of time that we have.
Well, despite what you might have heard in the national news over the last news cycle, the last few weeks, we have a tremendous governor. We have a tremendous legislature. And I thank my lucky stars every day that my family and I are here in Middle Tennessee. And I did want to ask, though, because it plays into the presidential campaign dynamics and in the primary that we're seeing in the GOP, where did Florida rank?
Well, Florida just edged out Tennessee and comes in at 9th best. And so that's another, I think, great success story of a state without a personal income tax. If you're going to do one policy well, out of the 15 that we measure, I think avoiding a personal income tax is the most important thing that a state can do. And it's hard to argue with that success when you look at Texas, Florida, and Tennessee specifically. But then the other 6 states that are no income tax states, there's a huge growth premium associated with being a no income tax state and not putting a price on earning a living and raising a family and growing a small business, because the vast majority of small businesses who are creating all the new net jobs, Matt, across the country, as you know, file on the small business side of the individual income
Yes.
tax, right? And so that is a huge job creation factor, and it's one of the things that has really kept Florida booming as well as Tennessee.
That's true. And I can tell you from my time working for Kentucky's governor that Kentucky consistently, we were competing, trying to get a number of businesses there, and we almost always lost when they realized they only had to go one state south to Tennessee to avoid the state income tax.
Bingo. And of course, two others in your region that you ought to keep an eye on is Sarah Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas doing some
she's
incredible
killing
things
it.
with
She's
education
killing it.
freedom and tax cuts. I mean, she's coming after Tennessee. I mean, they're at 15th right now in Arkansas, so not far behind. She wants to eliminate their income tax and follow the success of Tennessee on that front. And then, of course, you've got North Carolina that's moved from 26 to 2 over the last 10 years. And they're in their current law have a plan to phase out the business income tax altogether, first state in America to do so if it happens over the next several years.
Yes. I tell you, I know that this is a hotly anticipated publication. I thank you for all of the painstaking work that you have done with Art Laffer and Stephen Moore, and have so enjoyed having you as a guest. I hope you will come back and be with us.
That's a promise. Keep up the great work, and congrats to Tennessee on another great year in the rankings.
Thank you, Jonathan. And we will be right back on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.
It is 11 o'clock on the dot this Wednesday morning. I'm Ken Weaver with your top stories. Got the full forecast in 2 minutes. Some breaking news now coming out of Memphis. It looks like the family of Tyree Nichols, who died following a beating by police officers, has officially filed a federal lawsuit against the city of Memphis and its police department. And right now in Alabama, law enforcement have announced 2 arrests for the Sweet 16 party shooting that killed 4 people and injured 32 Saturday night in Dadeville.
Alabama law enforcement agencies, State Bureau of Investigation, officially arrested and charged Tyreek McCullough, 17 of Tuskegee, and Travis McCullough, 16, also of Tuskegee, with 4 counts of reckless murder each.
Prosecutors say both suspects will be tried as adults. And here in Tennessee, the State House could pass the bill that requires at least 1 armed security guard in every public school today. The bill's already passed the state Senate, and if passed by the House, it goes to Governor Lee. Here in Nashville, the resolution requiring Metro Police take over Metro school safety plans was rejected by the Metro Council last night. It comes after school board members expressed concern it could expose weaknesses in school security to the public. Well, District 26 Metro Council member Courtney Johnston tells WTN's Nashville's Morning News it's more about the school board avoiding accountability.
That's what the resolution said was, MNPD, what are your recommendations? And then MNPS, out of these recommendations, what are you going to do? When are you going to do them? And if you're not going to do them, why?
And the only explanation to the pushback given by school board chair Rachel Ann Elrod was a statement to Fox News where she said nothing will work as good as reasonable legislation, but she was not specific on the type of legislation. That's the latest news. Weather is next. I'm Ken Weaver, WTN News.
Good morning, Nashville. This is Matt Bassett back on SuperTalk. In just a few minutes, we will have former House Speaker Newt Gingrich joining the program for the first time. And in the meantime, I wanted to cover a story that I found in Politico because, in a way, it kind of had a Tennessee angle. So this week was supposed to be Governor Ron DeSantis's big day on Capitol Hill on Monday. And as Politico reports, yet Donald Trump managed to overshadow him from almost 1,000 miles away. In the 24 hours leading up to the Florida governor's much-anticipated meeting with GOP lawmakers, 2 members from his own state, Representatives John Rutherford and Greg Steube, endorsed Trump. A third Floridian, Brian Mast, once considered very close with DeSantis, told CNN's Mel Zanona that he will follow suit soon. A few hours later, in a stone-cold act of political brutality, Representative Lance Gooden, Republican of Texas, walked out of the DeSantis meeting and declared his support for Trump. Quote, "It's a killer," unquote, said one positively giddy Trump confidant who was on the phone with Playbook when news of Gooden's surprise endorsement broke. To be fair, DeSantis notched a couple of small victories. Freshman Laura Hall Lee, his former Secretary of State, endorsed him. When he spoke about the state's policy agenda, he decried the radical Biden administration and offered to help expand the House majority without once mentioning Trump. And it drew about 36 lawmakers. But at the end of the day, Trump had picked up more endorsements from Florida than DeSantis could muster with his boots on the ground. The article continues, not only did lawmakers leave the DeSantis event without delivering their backing, our colleagues Sarah Ferris, Ali Mutnick, and Burgess Everett report, but several tried to downplay their attendance, saying they went because the governor was a former colleague and they wanted to say hello. So the insight on this is in the ambush, these folks had made some calls to the Trump world to figure out how much of this was coordinated. Gooden's dramatic gesture, we're told, came as a complete surprise to the former president's brain trust, but much of the rest was quickly and carefully orchestrated over the past few days. It all began over the weekend when Trump was in our backyard for the RNC donor retreat and attended a meeting with friend of the program, Senator Bill Hagerty, with most of the state's GOP congressional delegation. Trump and his team were pleasantly surprised to learn the delegation was ready and eager to endorse him, and they did. That got Trump's people thinking, we've already had several from prominent Republicans, and they wondered if they could get others in the delegation to follow, just as DeSantis traveled to Capitol Hill. So on Sunday night, Trump officials sent emails to these members asking if they'd be willing to play ball. Quote, "Heck yes, I'd love to endorse him," one lawmaker replied. Beyond Mast, Rutherford, and Strub, and other members are expected to back Trump in the coming days. Quote, "The amazing part was how easy it was." One person close to Trump said, noting his team was shocked, for example, that Florida Republican Byron Donalds, who had introduced DeSantis and his family at the governor's election night victory party, was all in when they called him up recently. And we'll be watching this battle going back and forth for some period of time. And we will bring you all the coverage as the 2 top nominees duke it out. Well, at this point, I am pleased to welcome into the program a man who does not need an introduction, former Speaker of the House, my friend Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, how are you?
I'm doing great, and listen, you sound great, and I'm glad to have a chance to chat with you.
Oh, well, we are thrilled to have you. Where would we find you today?
Well, today I'm in Virginia, and just working on a variety of things, and trying to think through stuff that the Biden administration is doing that make no sense.
Oh, that's a long list.
It is. That's right. I feel like I have plenty of opportunities to think about these things.
Well, there's so much to cover. I did a lot in my opening monologue talking about the House GOP's efforts on Title IX and their efforts to protect women's sports, and that the bill is actually coming up this week. Your thoughts and perspectives on this?
Well, I think that in fact, I just wrote a newsletter which people can get at Gingrich 360 on this very issue. What we're watching is the Biden administration methodically taking apart Title IX, which was a very, very important civil rights effort to allow women and girls to participate fully in sports. And if you allow people who are born male to participate in women's sports, you virtually guarantee that women's sports will, in fact, be very deeply crippled, and that already we've seen 23 men win NCAA championships in women's sports, which I think is totally. I have two daughters and a granddaughter, and I think it's totally unfair to them to do that.
Yes. How do you, and I pointed out to our listeners that the bill passed out of the committee on complete party lines. All Republicans voted to support it. All Democrats voted against it. So they are clearly, as a party, on record against protecting women's sports.
Well, you know, I don't understand the degree to which transgenderism has come to dominate the Democratic Party. Most Americans, we run a project called the New American Majority Project, which people can actually go to newamericanmajorityproject.com and they can see all of our polling data. And when you look at our polling data, it is stunning how much the American people believe, for example, that there are two, that there are two sexes. They're not 40 or 50 or 60 genders in terms of biology. And when you look at that, and I believe in government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if you go out and ask the American people, for example, 72% oppose schools teaching children they can change their sex. 71% favor banning surgery on children to transition them from one gender to another. And those are a pretty clear definition of the American people of what they believe in and of what they think the government should be doing. And you have a Biden administration doing just the opposite.
It is, if someone had told me 5 years ago that you and I would be on the air together discussing this topic, I would have thought they were crazy.
Well, the fact is we're dealing with stuff which I think is almost a mental health issue rather than, it's not about left or right. As Sarah Huckabee Sanders said in her national address after the State of the Union, this is about normal and crazy. And I think that we're dealing with people who want to repudiate reality and want to create an alternative world.
Well, our mutual friend Jim Frogue was on earlier, and he wanted me to ask you this question because we talked about this wave of wokeness that is just being forced upon the American public that really has no interest in it whatsoever. And he wanted me to pose to you that you lived through the 70s when the country went hard left and then eventually snapped out of it. What do you see from a historic perspective as you look at where we are now? How do we snap out of this and move forward?
Well, I think that the fact is that in the late 60s, people tend to forget this, but there were over 1,200 bombings in the late 1960s. There were 1 million people gathered around the Pentagon in protest. I mean, there was a very big upsurge, and then it died away because as people thought about it, they decided they don't agree with it. And I think what you're seeing here is the same thing. This is I'll give you an example of the kind of overreach by the extremist left. The country does not want to have the government force it to buy electric cars. In fact, only 12% of the country, according to Gallup, only 12% of the country is prepared to consider buying an electric car. 88% say they're not prepared to look at buying an electric car. And yet Joe Biden and the left want to force us, whether we want it or not, to accept a car that we in fact don't want. And I think that's a good example where the country will presently rebel and will defeat all these people, which is exactly what happened. You may remember that Nixon, who was not, unlike Reagan, Nixon was not a naturally popular guy, and yet he won the largest percentage for re-election of any president since Franklin Roosevelt. He got 60% of the vote.
Yes.
Because people were so turned off by McGovern.
I hope that is foreboding for us in 2024. One of the things that I also wanted to pick your brain on, because you were involved with these clearly when you were Speaker, and people hear a lot about the debt ceiling fight. How do you kind of handicap that situation? Does Speaker McCarthy have any leverage there, and what should people be looking for?
Well, I think McCarthy right now is piecing together the votes to pass a debt ceiling that will have controls on spending, will have lower taxes and lower deficit and less debt payment on interest on the debt than Biden has proposed. And I think if he can get those votes, and he's working at it literally as you and I talk, I think probably next week they will pass it out of the House, and that will then pose a real problem for Biden, because the fact is that what Biden is doing, he doesn't want a clean debt ceiling. He wants a debt ceiling which will raise taxes, raise spending, increase debt ceiling, the interest on the debt that we pay,
yes,
weaken Medicare, weaken Social Security. I mean, the Biden budget is a disaster, and I think we have to start with that understanding. And I think the country at large, over 70% of the country favors a debt ceiling that does control spending.
Yes. Yes. And, you know, just going around the globe really quick, how concerned are you with the situation with China and Taiwan and our lack of deterrence there?
Well, I'm very concerned, because anytime you are faced with this kind of nuclear power, you've got to tread carefully. And you know, I don't think the Chinese communists want to risk an all-out war with the United States. But if they overreach, they could really have a huge problem, and we would then have to make a decision.
Well, it seems from the experts on this that they kind of have a two-pronged plan. That is, one, to try and affect the upcoming election in January and to remove President Xi and to provide basically a puppet to the Chinese government. I hear they're actually auditioning the people that they would want to run and put in that role. And it seems that if they are unsuccessful there, that you're looking at a possible blockade of the island, everything moving up to just a full-scale invasion. And it doesn't seem that we've put in place any of the diplomacy in the region with our friends and allies to set up the deterrence that would prevent them from doing so and put them in a position where, A, they don't know what the outcome will be, or B, it will be too costly for them to do it.
Well, I think that's right. And remember, if you're Taiwanese and you're watching the war in Ukraine, and you look at how much damage the Russians are doing to Ukrainian cities, it actually may make you more inclined to try to find some way to deal with the communist government, because the alternative looks so horrifying. I mean, people don't particularly want to know that we are prepared to, defend them as they get destroyed. They don't think of that as a success. So I think there's enormous psychological pressure on the Taiwanese people to try to find a solution.
Well, and the other thing that I'd love to get your perspective on, people and callers here have been asking, why is it that Chairman McCall approved these weapon systems for them, which they have, unlike Ukraine, they paid for $20 billion worth of weapon systems that still isn't there?
Well, I think the American bureaucracy is very slow, very cumbersome. Look at how slow they've been to help the Ukrainians. The Ukraine's been at war now for a year. and we're only beginning to get them some of the equipment that we should have sent them the first 30 days. I mean, it's really I think, a big challenge.
Would you agree that our strategic interests in Taiwan, being that they produce 90% of the world's semiconductors, just for one example, and that 60% of all trade goes through those waters, that we have a larger strategic interest there by far than we do in Ukraine?
Oh, yeah, there's no question. I mean, the strategic interest we have in Ukraine is precautionary. That is, if Russia were to get away with occupying Ukraine, what does it do next? And if it moves into Poland or Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, that triggers NATO, and that becomes just a nightmare. So I think that's a different kind of strategic problem. The problem you have both in the South China Sea and you have in Taiwan itself is that such a large portion of the world's trade goes through that region, and Taiwan itself is such an enormous provider of computer chips.
Yes.
That at that point, you really have to confront the possibility that we would go to whatever level of war was necessary, and I think that's really significant.
And Mr. Speaker, as our time is winding down, I did want to let folks know that you have a new book coming out. I believe it's entitled The March to the Majority, and it deals with the 1994 Contract with America campaign and the success that you had there. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I wrote a book describing how we won the first majority in 40 years and the first re-elected majority in 68 years since 1928, and then how we got Bill Clinton to sign conservative reforms, including welfare reform, 4 consecutive balanced budgets for the only time in your lifetime. And it's really, I think, a very dynamic book, and it's almost like a cookbook for conservatives and Republicans on this is how you can do it, and this is why it will work.
Great. And how can people get that?
Just for the moment, just go to Amazon and put in Newt Gingrich. And the book is entitled March to the Majority. And Matt, I really appreciate you raising that idea.
Yes, absolutely. And anything as we're closing, any thoughts on the 2024 race and things that Republicans need to be focused on?
I think this will be one of the biggest referendums on what kind of future we want that we've ever had. We're either going to go towards a bigger government with more coercion, defining for Americans, what we are allowed to think and do, or we're going to go back towards freedom. And I think this election will have an enormous impact on which of those occurs.
Yeah, I think a lot of us in the media grow tired of saying that this is the most consequential election we've ever had. However, I think this is.
Yeah, I think 4 more years of Biden will be a total disaster for the country. But again, the American people in the end are in charge. And if they're willing to have these extremist values and these tax increases and this huge government, and they're willing to be told what they're allowed to think and what they're allowed to do, that is their prerogative. But my hunch is that they're not going to go for that.
Oh, your lips to God's ears. I so hope you are right, Mr. Speaker.
Listen, I'm delighted with what you're doing, and I hope you'll continue to talk and continue to reach out. But I'm glad I could be with you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Have a wonderful day. And folks, I just want to remind folks that we will be coming back with Dr. Robert Redfield. You will not want to miss that interview. And we will be back after the break on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.
Tyree Nichols' family making it official in Memphis. And right now in Alabama, the district attorney investigating the Sweet 16 party mass shooting details how he's going to handle the situation now that there have been 2 arrests. These stories and more at 11:30 on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.
Thank you, Brother Ken. Matt Bassett with you. At a point in the show, we'd normally be ramping down, but we are not doing that. We are ramping up. And after a short break, we are going to come back with Dr. Robert Redfield. He will discuss the actual origins of the coronavirus, which he has been right on the entire time. And we'll also talk about some of the threats being posed by gain-of-function research that sadly continue today. And I want to thank all the guests that we have had so far, EJ and Tony, Jonathan Williams, and, of course, Jim Frogue, and a super thank you for former Speaker Gingrich for giving us the time this morning. But you're going to want to stay with us for Dr. Robert Redfield, a colleague that I so enjoyed working with, so enjoy his internal fortitude and sticking to his guns when the whole world was attacking him. And you'll want to hear from him. So we will be right back after a short break on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.
$11:30 on the dot. I'm Ken Weaver with your top stories. We're already 73 degrees here on Music Row, headed for the 80s. Changes still coming. We'll tell you about it during the full forecast in 2 minutes. Right now in Tennessee, Tyree Nichols' family has officially filed a lawsuit against the city of Memphis and Memphis Police Department and the individual officers involved in his beating death. And right now in Alabama, the district attorney, they're investigating the Sweet 16 party mass shooting, says that 2 arrests have been made.
Even though these are 16 and 17-year-olds, we will be charging them as adults.
17-year-old Tyreek McCullough of Tuskegee and 16-year-old Travis McCullough, also of Tuskegee, are charged with 4 counts of reckless murder each. No motive was mentioned during this news conference. That's the latest news. Weather's next. I'm Ken Weaver, WTN News.
Hi, I'm Paul Winkler. Have you ever thought about why we invest in the stock market? Well, you often hear because we want to protect ourselves from inflation. Well, what is inflation? It's prices going up. Who's raising prices? Companies. What do you own when you own stocks? You own the companies raising prices, so it helps protect us from that. The other thing is this. Think about the most successful people you know. They're typically business owners, and you get to be a business owner when you invest in the stock market. Now, if we think about the stock market, a lot of people worry about, well, what if the stock market drops and it never comes back? Well, this is another thing that I like to explain to people. If the stock market goes down and it never comes back, what does that mean? That means that earnings went down and they never came back up again. So earnings went down. If earnings go down, what else goes down? Taxes go down. If taxes go away, what else goes away? The government goes away. If the government goes away, the FDIC goes away. So think about it. Everything is built on the stock market. That's why I don't ever worry about the stock market going down. Everybody has the same goal in mind when stocks go down. Get it to come back up because we got to get earnings to come back up. Now, you have 2 things at your control to get earnings to come back up. One is sales. We can change what we're selling or sell more of whatever we have if we can. And if we can't do that, we can reduce our expenses. And that's exactly what companies do. You'll notice that they lay off people when things get bad, and hence that is why the stock market has recovered from every downturn throughout all of history. Now, if you want to learn more about our approach to investing and financial planning, go to paulwinkler.com and set up a free 15-minute phone call or call 615-851-1950.
And we're back on Super Talk. This is Matt Bassett bringing us into our final hour. And I am pleased beyond measure that we are now going to be joined by the former CDC director, my colleague, one of the most fun people to work with at HHS, who has a tremendous sense of humor that you never get to see because he's talking about all these life and death type of issues. But I want to welcome on into the program Dr. Robert Redfield. Dr. Redfield, how are you?
Great to be with you, Matt.
Wonderful to have you on. And our listeners have appreciated the bold stance that you took from the beginning. And I want to just make a clarification so folks know. I left the administration just a few months before the COVID pandemic hit. So I will apologize to you on air for not being there to have your back during that time, but that was something that we did not see coming.
Yep, we didn't see it coming. It was obviously a complicated time.
It was, and a lot of people have followed your commentary on this and your comments, but if you would, take us back to the beginning and essentially the throttling that you got from the press and from some of your colleagues from the early days of the pandemic, where you suggested that we at least talk about the fact that it looked like this actually came from a lab leak and that it went from humans to animals and not animals to humans.
Well, Matt, we go back to New Year's Eve in 2019 is when I first was informed by my CDC colleagues, because we had an office in Beijing, that there were 27 cases of a new unspecified respiratory illness that was not flu. And we always had a heightened concern about the potential of a respiratory epidemic, particularly coming from bird flu and most likely coming out of China. I talked to my counterpart, George Gao, then, who was the head of CDC China, and he told me about the 27 cases and that they had an unspecified pneumonia and that they all came from the wet market in Wuhan. And I asked him what his case definition was, and he said an unspecified pneumonia that wasn't flu from people who came from the wet market. And I said, well, George, by definition, everybody comes from the wet market, because that's your case definition. You need to go outside the wet market and look for people who have an unspecified pneumonia, which he did over the next couple of days. And he called me back and he told me that they had hundreds of cases and it had nothing to do with the wet market. So from the very beginning, the wet market was sort of set up as a roost because there was the point of view that that would then be the etiology of the source of the origin of this new virus. It came from the wet market and sort of play off SARS and MERS that came from an intermediate host. The problem with that whole story, and we didn't know it there at that time, I didn't at least, is that the epidemic in Wuhan actually started somewhere between August and October. It didn't start in December, late December, January at all. I looked at this virus as a virologist when we first saw it, and George had told me he didn't think there was any evidence of human-to-human transmission. I told him I was concerned that that may not be true because of the first 27 cases he had. 3 of them occurred in clusters. He said he was pretty confident that there wasn't human-to-human transmission. But very quickly, we learned that unfortunately that wasn't true. But when we looked at this virus initially in Wuhan, we saw that it was very rapidly human-to-human transmissible, that George was incorrect, and that they were literally having thousands of cases. And so, as you know, and you and I have talked about this, when you looked at SARS, it came into humans 2003 from intermediate bat to civet cat to humans, but it never learned how to go efficiently human to human, and that's why there was less than 1,000.
I think we have just lost Dr. Redfield, so we will work to get him back on the line. I'm sure he will be back with us very shortly. But the point that he was making while we wait for him to get back is that SARS. Oh wait, hold on. SARS went from one animal to another animal and resulted in the death of about 10,000 people. MERS, the same thing. It went from one animal to another animal and killed about 10,000 people. But it was nothing like what we were seeing. Dr. Redfield, do we have you back?
We're back. I'm sorry. I was talking to myself.
No, not at all. I was just continuing your thought on the MERS and SARS.
I said that, yeah. So the fact is that neither the SARS or MERS really ever learned how to efficiently go human to human. But COVID immediately was one of the most infectious human viruses that we'd ever seen. And so to me, that made it really very unlikely that this virus had somehow gone from an intermediate host to humans, and that this virus had to somehow be educated how to affect humans efficiently. And we actually had evidence for that because these scientists from the Wuhan lab published a paper in 2014 where they published that they successfully learned how to take a SARS-like virus and to teach it how to infect a human receptor called the H2 receptor and become highly infectious in humanized mice. So we know that they were working to accomplish this. So this is where I argued with Fauci and others that I didn't think it was scientifically plausible that this virus came from an intermediate animal and now was one of the most infectious viruses for humans. The second thing I didn't think was scientifically plausible, that they said this virus came from a bat into some animal and then into humans, and they of course hadn't found the intermediate. But the other thing that's important, if you take the SARS virus now, the COVID virus now, and you ask it to try to infect bats, it has a trouble. It's not an efficient virus to infect bats. That's also not scientifically possible. So I came of the view that it was more likely that this virus had been educated in how to infect humans. And then there's a lot of other things that we found out very early. Some of it's been declassified now, in particular the furin cleavage site. When we started looking at this virus, we found some really significant abnormalities, that it had a very unusual furin cleavage site that other coronaviruses didn't have. And that was basically changing the orientation of the binding site of the virus for the H2 receptor to allow efficient human transmission. We thought that was, more engineered. We saw other evidence that the interferon response element had been downplayed so that when you got this virus, you wouldn't get sick or would get symptoms. So there's a lot of evidence that this virus was manipulated with. And this is why I came to favor the lab leak hypothesis. I always told Fauci and Farrar and others in January that what they needed to do is NIH had to do the scientific leadership to form groups to go after the two hypotheses, both lab leak and spillover, to do them aggressively, to do it transparently, and let's see if we can get better data on which one of these two hypotheses is more credible. Unfortunately, rather than do that, what they chose to very rapidly to coalesce around a single narrative that this had to come from a spillover event and the wet market. And this is why I go back. I think the Chinese also played into that roost to set up the scenario that this was from the wet market and not from a lab.
Well, one of the things I think a lot of people would want to ask you, if they could, was why do you feel that you got the pushback that you did based on all of the science? When you remove the politics from it, why do you think from American virologists and American policymakers did you get the level of pushback that you got within the White House task force, within other areas of HHS? Why would they be so adamant to at least having the conversation when all the science was pointing to what you were pointing out?
Well, two reasons. The first would be the scientific community. NIH, and Colin said this in his own email to Fauci, that we have to dismiss this lab leak theory. We have to maintain scientific harmony. The scientific community wanted to pursue gain of function research. right? They want to protect gain-of-function research. Yeah, obviously, if this pandemic was a consequence of gain-of-function research, that could have some negative consequences on that goal to maintain. I argued in 2012 when a group of scientists in Europe had figured out how to take bird flu and to change it, a number of amino acids, and change it so it went from not being able to infect humans efficiently to being highly effective and efficient in infecting humans. I argued that science should.
Oh, I think we have lost Dr. Redfield again.
Hey, it must be in a poor cell connection. Let me call him back.
Yeah. So, but what just floors me is that to protect the gain-of-function research, that they would have misled the American people and the world for such a long period of time, and no one's ever apologized for that. It absolutely floors me, and I think it floors most Americans. And I think this gets to why, among a myriad of reasons, that people have not been happy with the way Dr. Fauci did this. He allowed politics to be injected into this. And I don't mean to steal Adam Carolla's line, but when he tells us that we can't gather in large crowds, we have to stop the spread. And then they say, well, Dr. Fauci, what about Black Lives Matter? And he says, I have no opinion on that. And I think it was the inconsistency of this message and the injection of politics when it should have been based on the science. Dr. Redfield, are you back with us?
I'm back. I
Great.
don't know about our connections. I didn't think we were that far from Nashville.
No, I can't explain it. But you were at the point where you were explaining the pushback based on wanting to protect gain-of-function research.
Because I think that's the one side was wanting to protect gain-of-function, and the scientific community went aggressively to do that and coalesce, and really very rapidly, as you know, in early September, really kind of label anybody that thought differently as a conspiratorial individual. So it was really that a whole approach that Collins and Fauci and others went into is antithetical to science, because what science should have done was embrace both hypotheses and fostered rigorous debate.
Well,
and they didn't do that. But then there's another side of it, which was the geopolitical, right? Which I think was also very alive, that there was a reluctance to have any geopolitical controversy with China. I don't blame China. Many people misinterpret my position because China happened to be the laboratory that was doing this link. The science was funded by the United States government, largely. The NIH, the USAID, the State Department, the Defense Department, they all funded this research. The European and American scientific community supported this gain-of-function research. Where China really has some culpability is that they didn't follow the treaty to allow us to go in within 24 hours after the epidemic was recognized. And then they weren't transparent and open after that. But the actual event of having the virus, which I believe came out of the lab, which I believe caused the greatest pandemic that we've had to face as a human species, and which I believe was a direct consequence of science, not nature, that was really the consequence of the United States, the global scientific community, and the Chinese scientists. So it's not like pointing fingers just at China.
Yes, and in our closing minute here, I know that you've led on warning about gain-of-function research. I know that Senator Paul has been very big on this. How much does gain-of-function research, despite all we've been through, still pose a threat to the American public and to the world?
Yeah, I think it's a big threat. I think I always tell people that the COVID pandemic was the minor pandemic. The great pandemic is coming, and it's going to be brutal. It's going to be a bird flu pandemic, which will have anywhere from a 5 to 50% mortality. It will cause a great loss of human life. I do anticipate it to come, if it had to go by the species barrier, from a bird to humans the normal way, it could take decades, if not centuries. But it doesn't have to go that way anymore. It could take literally weeks to months to create that virus in the laboratory. So I really do think it's the gain of function research that is going to lead to a bird flu pandemic, which will be the great pandemic, and or bioterrorism. And this is the great threat right now. I've argued that the number one national security threat for the United States is not China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran. The number one biosecurity threat for national security threat for the United States is biosecurity. That's what has the potential to change our way of life. And our nation, unfortunately, is totally unprepared to confront it. We need to basically develop an enormous program proportional to the threat, similar to what we have in the Defense Department for China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. We need to put it in the Defense Department. We need to build that capacity with the private-public partnerships we need to make the countermeasures. And we need to get that in place because the great pandemic will come. And this is why I've been a very strong advocate to put a moratorium on gain-of-function research, because I think that's the vehicle which is most likely to be the causation of the next and what I consider the great pandemic.
Well, Dr. Redfield, I can't thank you enough for your courage and conviction on this issue. I hope that we will be seeing you on the Hill as these hearings continue, and you have been proven right day after day after day. It's the intelligence community today, and thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being willing to be with us.
Yeah, thanks. Definitely we can do it again when we have a better connection. God bless.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Nashville. We will see you soon on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.